Well, yeah, and of course Luther agreed with that too, that faith without works, if it's about faith, they'll know we're not, if faith is just believing in a principle, well, of course, that doesn't save anybody. But that last night Tim, I think, said something interesting in his sermon, that that faith lives embodied in the neighbor. It isn't my faith or my faith journey, which is what you hear about now. It has nothing to do with your journey. You don't have a journey anymore. Sorry, your journey comes to an end. Levi's journey is at an end when Jesus calls. There's no place to go. Now you have a new life that's just simply given, and it's Jesus' life, and it is set out before you in the Word. So I'm sorry now, I lost track of what you were talking about, what you were asking. James, I'm sorry. So of course, there's no such thing as faith without works. And that's classic in our confessions, except our confessions are always saying, first we've got to have faith, then we have works. That faith, that works flow from faith, and we don't want to screw this up and put it the other way around and say we have to have works in order to really have faith, or have faith that counts. And Bonhoeffer is saying, but we've lost the incarnate Christ, because these have become empty words. So let's go back to the synoptic gospels and get the concreteness of the message again, so we can recover the very message that the Reformers recovered, and Paul's message again, which is justification by faith alone, apart from works of the law.
Okay, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So it's easy for us to pick on Germany because that's like 70, 80 years ago, whatever.
Right.
In our own circumstances, to get real, as kids would say, we see the cheap grace thing kind of now. We've been to sometimes I've been to some things like at Mount Carmel, and there's a group there that say, yeah, that pretty much clings to that cheap grace concept, although they wouldn't call it cheap grace. I don't think they've quite got it right, but they think they do. And Herb Loddix is dead, and Carol Henderly's dead, so we can't. But a couple of these guys are real fanatic followers of the deceased, Herb Loddix. And so they think that we've gone astray because we believe in what you're calling costly grace down there. And yet, I see this sometimes with some of the other denominations. I don't want to pick on people, but like say Wisconsin Synod or Missouri Synod, you can adhere to this doctrine, and I see people, within our other denomination, us too, you can adhere to this doctrine of justification by faith, and it's a head trip. It's all in their head. It's a theory. They can't apply it.
Yeah.
And in terms of works righteousness, we see people like the evangelicals, some of the LCMC people, all of us, we all fall into this, like you say, we can't help ourselves. That's the bondage of the will.
Right.
That we want to do good works.
Yeah.
We want to read James. We resolve that we're going to go out and not sin anymore. It's in some of our prayers that you lead us not to sin anymore. I know the minute we walk out of here, like you can't, like Flannery O'Connor, you a thought goes through your head and there it all goes. So what we talked about this, I think in class too, instead of calling it cheap grace, it might be full grace, like FAUX. It's a phony grace.
Right.
It isn't a real grace.
It's not grace at all.
And the cost of grace is extraordinarily expensive. It's free to us, but it cost God his son. We can never get away from the fact that Isaac saw a ram. Abraham saw a ram in the thicket and saved Isaac.
Yeah.
But there was no ram in the thicket for God's own son.
No.
And there is where the cost comes in. And like you're saying, the evangelicals and some of the other Lutherans want to take cost of grace and turn it into works righteousness. Like
Right.
we have to buck up and just do better.
Well, you know what? We all have to do this. This is what Bonhoeffer did in his context. He was reacting to a specific error that grew out of a specific understanding, I would say misunderstanding, of Lutheranism. Now, we have some of that, as you mentioned, but we also have, what we have is something similar that really doesn't grow out of Lutheranism, it just grows out of Protestantism in general, and that is the gospel of acceptance, that is similarly unincarnate, a gospel that is simply a principle, the principle of inclusivity, right? So we're all included, that's the gospel. God welcomes us all, that's the gospel. We're all accepted. God accepts us just as we are, and so of course we accept everybody else just as we are. Again, you got language that's, this close to the gospel, but it misses the mark completely.
Yeah.
So
Roy Harrison Jr. would talk about, God didn't come to do business with you. He built the church isn't a shop. And what the gospel calls us, this is what I was getting at before, is we shut down shop. When you walk away from your table, you've shut down your shop. You're not trying to do business with God anymore. Now, to use the Bonhoeffer terms, you're following him. It's that you're not trying to be in the quid pro quo game where if I do this, you give me this
Right.
anymore. Which is, I think in missions there's a word for it, but it's like you're trying to control God.
well,
If I do this, then you have to give me, then I've earned.
well, that's the first here, of course, or even here. And, well, the thing is that, like our teacher Garrett Furdy said, the only solution is we have to die. There's no other solution. And that's what Jesus came to do, to give us his death. And we live his death. And that's what Levi is doing. So he's at an end. Of course, we know there's the symbol. He's also here. But, and the thing is that it's so difficult to find your way. When you're up here, preaching on Sunday morning, you have a particular text, it's so easy to go off on the right or left. To miss the mark, because this is so natural to us, right? So easy. That's why we have seminaries. That's why you have to learn this stuff and learn what you're doing, so you're not just goofing off up here and completely blowing it. You'll do that often enough anyway, But we have to make this case nowadays that it's hard work to find your way, and even this, of course, can get just twisted just a little, and it can become, as Bonhoeffer said later in his letters and papers in prison, he wrote, I was trying to make myself holy, a saint, and he's just that close to it. Yeah, Michael.
It sounds a lot like the constant conversation that's going on beyond pastors, or among pastors right now about churches that are shrinking in mainline Lutheranism, and is it because we don't teach the word? If we teach the word and share the gospel, who cares if the church is shrinking? But on the other hand, aren't we supposed to have programs to try to build the church, which sounds counterproductive to sharing a word and sacrament?
Well, of course, it ultimately is not about numbers, as you said. Right. Here's the thing, that if you're doing our version of this heresy, which is what I suggested, the gospel of acceptance, people are comfortable, people like it, but they don't really need it. Once you know that God accepts you, why do you have to keep coming to church all the time? It's boring. It's just marshmallows, that are being handed out, all this mushy stuff about, how God loves us, God accepts us, and wonderful, wonderful, and there's no wrath, there's no anger, there's no sin, there's no justification, nothing is there. Christ himself isn't there. How can you, be against God being a loving God and so on? But I'm going to say that eventually that will shrink the church, because why bother? Here, why do you need the church? You don't have Christ, you don't need the church. You've got this, once you know the principle, you know it. And then you're okay. I mean, you don't need to come to church on Sunday because you're not involved in this struggle, like Lene said a little while ago. You don't desperately come here and because you need the Word, and you need the comfort of the sacrament, because you're just you don't need it. So that, on the one hand, that's going to shrink the church. On the other hand, you preach the cross. Carrying around the death of Jesus is not very attractive and is not necessarily going to get a lot of people. But, Claude.
Well, reading through Scripture, we see that God always deals with the remnant.
Yeah.
And that is where the Spirit works the most and the hardest.
Right.
And the issue in our country today is that church became a fashion and a fad.
Yeah.
And then once it lost its popularity, and once that we went from making disciples to filling buildings. And once we made that change, then that's what the shallow church, so to speak, is what we created.
That's the spirit prevailing here.
Yeah.
Consumerism. You want, if you build a shopping mall, you want it filled with people, and you don't, and you want them to commit to the extent that they buy stuff, but, and then you have to have your pulse on what people want, because you have to keep ahead of that, and that becomes what the church becomes.
I've always contended that the way to grow the church is to burn the buildings.
Yeah. On the other hand, let me say this, then. We're flesh and blood, and the church is flesh and blood, and that means that there has to be an actual place where we meet, and it also is a witness in the midst of the community when you have that building. So it would, in terms of our use of resources, it would be wonderful if we could dispense with the building and just rent a space to meet, but then people don't find us. It's really hard. I mean, everybody, that's the almost universal experience of church planners, as I understand it. You really don't take off till you build a building. But, John.
I'm sitting looking at your three illustrations, and I'm trying to figure out why the bottom one is the hardest, the most difficult one to illustrate. And I think I know what it is. The top two are all based on continuity of self.
Right.
I mean, there's no break. I mean, if I have a principle of works,
Yeah.
and then I do good works, and then I measure how much progress I've made, and I go back and I learn the principle of works again, and I practice, and I do a little better,
Right.
and I can get this thing going, and
Right.
I improve.
Right.
And the same thing with the principle of grace. I learn to forgive myself better and better. But in the constantly grace model, there's a, to use Harrisville's word, there's a fracture here.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's a discontinuity in Levi.
Right.
I mean, this is counterintuitive. A stranger comes up to you and says, "Follow me," and he leaves everything and follows him.
No explanation. No.
Right?
No explanation.
It makes no sense.
No.
And so, with Levi, the encounter with Jesus brings his life to an end.
It does.
It's a death.
Bonhoeffer talks about
New life.
there's no reflection involved. It isn't like Levi had been thinking about, well, what about this Jesus guy? Maybe that would be a good deal for me to be a part of him and become one of his disciples, that probably would be a more fulfilling life, a better life for me. None of that is there. That would be the continuity then. Then it would be his initiative, his decision, and his weighing good and evil and saying, well, I think Jesus is my good, so I think I'll go with him. There's nothing like that. It's totally contingent. All of a sudden, it's just because it's Jesus. And that's the end for Levi.
I think in
Yeah.
the call of Simon Peter, I think that the little phrase, they left their father in the boat.
Ah,
I mean, it says it all.
it does it, yeah, yeah.
There's a break, it's a fracture in their life.
Right.
And I think that's the difference. Is we want to think of rites of passage and progress, but what we're talking about here is death and resurrection.
And there's a radical discontinuity in that way between Jesus and all other rabbis. Because otherwise, basically in Jewish life, you are attracted, you want to go and study with this rabbi because this rabbi offers such deep insight or wisdom or has this reputation. But you don't, you don't have this radical discontinuity. It's not the gospel. This is the gospel because it is the announcement. This is the end. He's here. This is it. It's the end. He's Lord of the Sabbath. He doesn't just expound on the Sabbath. He's Lord of it. And so so there's only one person that can make that kind of claim. And again, it's not Hitler. You see? You see what he's getting at here? And so what's going to happen is now, if you're a German, it's 1935. What does obedience mean for you? For Levi, it meant getting up and, walking after Jesus. For a German, it meant on Sunday morning you get up and you go to the local confessing church congregation, you identify with them, you get a card that says, member of the confessing church, and you carry that card. And you are stepping out of the Gleichschaltung, the being conformed, everybody in uniform, everybody united, that was their strength and their unity, and this was exhilarating. I mean, everybody united. Well, like Bonhoeffer's students. And then when he writes in the opening page of Life Together about living in the midst of your enemies, that's not abstract, because they were. I mean, his Bruderhaus, his students that were part of his community, were seeing the inside. 21 of them in 1937 were arrested. I mean, most of them were released after a little while, but I mean, they knew. They faced lots of hardship. They were imprisoned. This was not abstract, because you stepped out of the crowd, you stepped out of conformity with that spirit that was sweeping through. So what does that mean for us? How do we step out of conformity with the spirit of our times at the call of Jesus, when Jesus calls us? And for Bonhoeffer, it was what Germany needed was these little bands of disciples living under the cross, persecuted, suffering the contempt, even the hatred of their neighbors, traitors to the new Germany. That was the idea. Why? For two reasons. Because then Germany in the 1930s, everybody would know where Jesus is. Jesus is with them. That's where he is. Because he's displayed visibly to the world. They don't see themselves, they see Jesus. I'm getting into the Sermon on the Mount now, This is visible. Everybody sees it. It's the city set on a hill. It's the light that you set on the lampstand. You don't hide under a bushel. It's in the lamp. Everybody sees the light. Cannot be hid. It's the salt, in the earth. Sermon on the Mount, right? All these people, what are they? They're the complete opposite of everything that they're being told they should be. They are the poor in spirit. This is just the time when finally Germany is getting their spirit back. They've been so beaten down, and it's so wonderful. We've got spirit now, right? They're poor in spirit. Meek, we're strong. Mourning, we are joyful. Kraft durch Freude. What's he doing? In all of this, as he expounds the Sermon on the Mount, he's grabbing these words that have been stolen. He calls them in ethics the stolen words of human community. He's reclaiming them and giving them their Christological content, which is their real content for any kind of human community and human experience. Obedience. That's a big word. I obey you, my Führer. I pledge you my obedience. Who has the right to pledge to my obedience? He doesn't have that right. Only insofar as I could see that he is somehow put there by God doing God's will. Otherwise, he has absolutely no right to claim my total obedience. All obedience, when it's good, whether it's obedience to my parents, obedience to my government, or whatever it is, obedience to my teacher, it all has its legitimacy only insofar as it participates in this ultimate obedience that Jesus creates in the world, because he is the Logos, the Son of God. So they don't see this community, this little band of disciples, they don't see their own obedience. They don't see their own extraordinariness. They're just ordinary. They're not being extraordinary, but that's extraordinary in this world, right? I mean, being ordinary, being that little band of persecuted disciples under the cross. Everybody, when the question is, where's Jesus? Where's Jesus? There he is. He's not a principle, he's real. He's incarnate right here among us. There's the Church of Jesus Christ right there. You want to go? You go there. That's where he is. Physically, put one foot in front of the other, literally. There he is. He can be located in this world. For those who have eyes to see. On the other hand, they don't see it themselves. They see only Jesus. Beware of practicing your piety before men. Remember that? That's in chapter 6 of the Sermon on the Mount, right? Yeah. And in fact, that little band is in chapter 7. They have no assurance, if they start looking at themselves, that they aren't people who are saying, Lord, Lord, and he's going to say in the end, I never knew you. Because the division between the church and the world goes right into the church, too. And we don't have, as long as we're looking at ourselves, we have no assurance whatsoever. And thereby we're called back to faith in Jesus Christ alone and his promise. At the same time, suddenly, there's resistance in the world against the demonic. And the powers that be see a judgment spoken against them in this little band of disciples under the cross. A limit. You don't do this. You especially don't persecute the Jewish people, because we're standing with this Jew, Jesus. They're God's chosen. You don't do that. Or you persecute anybody. The handicapped, the mentally ill, the mentally retarded, the gypsies, the Slavs, whatever. It's a word of judgment against that power. That if it became visible, if people saw it, if it happened, can be a restrainer, a restraining force. Could even have been a restraining force on Hitler. There was an incident in which the Nazis overreached in their attempt to suppress the church when they imprisoned Bishop Wurm, a Bavarian Lutheran bishop. And the people were incensed. They swarmed into the churches. And when Bishop Wurm, let's see, I know they were scurrying people, from place to place, from churches. People were in the streets, and the Gestapo and the Nazi officials panicked. We're losing it. We're losing control here. And they immediately, backed off. See what they had? It looked, from the outside, the regime looked impenetrable and like any resistance was futile, but it was really just a thin tissue of lies. And it only needed to be pricked a little bit. And of course, the people in power were living in terror that it would happen, because they knew at some level that, and so if the church had just stood a little bit, just like, wait a minute, you can't do that to our pastor. The whole thing is exposed for the big lie it is. As soon as people say, no, you can't do those things. We're just not going to allow this. So it was even just the church standing up for, if they'd even just stood up for themselves and said, we're going to be the church, you're not going to do that. They could have made a big difference. Yeah.